Thank you, Aman, and thank you to Rob, my host, as well. Welcome everybody to this Sunday morning. I'm glad everyone's here, and I'd like to pay my respects firstly to every single person in this room and every person from every great nation that has come to Australia that makes it the nation that it is today, as well as the original people. Everybody in this country deserves to be respected and acknowledged because we live in a multicultural society, and this society is not about creating division. It's about equality and coming together as one. So thank you all for contributing to this nation. So now we've got the formalities over and done with. I'd also like to say that I just recently got back from overseas, and I'd like to talk about this particular subject because it's close to my heart. And there's other people who are overseas that are being forced into being part of Australia, and their right to self-determination is being denied. And I'm talking about the island of Norfolk. So basically, I just got back from Norfolk last week. I was there for a week, and I met with ex-members of the Legislative Assembly, which has been dissolved now. So the Norfolk Island government was dissolved by the Australian government. So we have once again, I was talking about division. Well, there's division in Norfolk Island compared to the rights that you have to walk down the street and go to your local member's office and to have a chat with him and to be represented in the parliament, in your local parliament and in your federal parliament. The people of Norfolk Island are denied this. The Norfolk Island government, which is now a local government, it's a regional council, excuse me. Sunday morning. So basically what we're going to discuss first is there's a myth that's going around. Has anybody heard about the myth that Australia is Norfolk Island? I thought you would have. So it's interesting because I heard of this myth a long time ago, possibly 3 to 4 years ago. And I went and, well, after people brought it to my attention and asked me whether there was any validity to it, I went to research it and to validate it, and I found quite the opposite. And the first telling thing was I went and read the Norfolk Island Enabling Act of Australia. And that particular act said quite early in the act that Commonwealth law does not apply on Norfolk Island. Straight away I knew that Norfolk Island was not Australia if the Commonwealth law did not apply there. And that was until 2016, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So what we're going to look at is this phenomenon that people speak about, which is Norfolk Island Australia? Because I can categorically tell you that it is not. One other telling thing is when I flew to Norfolk Island, has anyone been overseas here? Most of you? When you return from overseas, you're given a small customs card and you fill in where you've been, where you're going to be staying in Australia, whether you've come in contact with any particular diseased persons, and whether you have dangerous goods such as foods or firearms, etc., etc. Now, when you go to Norfolk Island, you're given this card, and I scratched my head thinking, why am I being given this card if I'm going to Norfolk Island? And it's allegedly Australia. Well, over the announcement, the loudspeaker of the plane comes to the pilot and he says, wherever you see the word Australia on the customs card, cross it out and put Norfolk Island. So you're clearly not flying to Australia, as the myth goes. So where does this myth come from? It comes from an act called the Acts Interpretation Act. And basically there's been a couple of different amendments to that act, and they happened in 2016. So in early 2016, the definition of Australia meant the Commonwealth of Australia, and when used in a geographical sense, included the territory of Christmas Island and the territory of Cocos-Keeling Islands, but it did not include any other external territory. In other words, Norfolk Island. And this was a definition from about 1973. I'm sure you all know that date and why that's a very important date. Now, later on in 2016, the definition changed. There was actually 3 different amendments to the Act in 2016, very unusual. And it changed to this: Australia means the Commonwealth of Australia, the same as the last one, when used in a geographical sense, includes Norfolk Island, the territory of Christmas Island and the territory of Cocos-Keeling Island, but does not include any other external territory. So you can see that in late 2016, Norfolk Island was actually added to the definition of Australia in a geographical sense. Now, we're talking about geography, we're talking about the land. So they're saying, when you look at all of these different territories, geographically, they are part of the landmass of Australia, not politically. And this is the mistake of the myth, because it's saying that Australia is Norfolk Island, and it's talking about the body politic. And it's saying somehow that the body politic is in Norfolk Island, and it's running Terra Australis, which is where we all live, not the Commonwealth. So you can easily debunk this by simply looking at it in that respect. It's in a geographical sense and not in a political sense or in an economic sense. So what else we're going to look at, because one thing you can't do when you read an act, you can't cherry pick the act. You can't just go into the act and grab that definition and say that, well, we're going to apply a legal maxim to it, and then we're going to, once we've interpreted that, we're going to take that as the new meaning, because that's very dangerous. And what you have to do is you have to read the Act as a whole. And lucky for you, I've gone and read the Act, and there's only about 3 or 4 sections here that we actually have to raise, okay, that apply in this particular circumstance. But it'll all make crystal clear sense to you quite quickly. So Section 15AA of the Act provides that the interpretation that would best achieve the purpose or object of the Act is to be preferred to any other interpretation. So the question at hand is would the interpretation that Australia is Norfolk Island best achieve the purpose or object of the Act? Is an interpretation claiming Australia Norfolk Island to be preferred to each other interpretation? And what of the territory of Christmas Island and Cocos Islands? See, they're part of the definition as well. Yet the myth says only Norfolk Island is Australia. Yet we have this particular class of entities in that definition which are territories. So there's a class of entities there. Territories. Just remember, Australia is not a territory. Australia has territories. So that is the issue, the first issue that needs to be looked at, is the fact that in interpreting a provision of an Act, the interpretation that would best achieve the purpose or object of the Act is to be preferred to each other interpretation. So Do you think, and put yourself in the position of the legislator, person who wrote the Act, were they sitting there conspiring and coming up with these nefarious ideas that there's an island off the coast of Australia and Australia was really being ruled from that island? Because this is what the myth proclaims. So let's continue. So section 15AB of the Act provides guidelines for the use of extrinsic material in the interpretation of an Act. So material that you can use to interpret an Act, here is the list. Let's apply it to the theory. So subsection 1 provides if material not forming the Act is capable of assisting to discover the true meaning of the provision, consideration can be given to that material. And section 1A states that extrinsic material is to be used to confirm the ordinary meaning of the provision. The ordinary meaning. Not some wacky, out there interpretation where you apply a legal maxim, which we'll get to, and we'll show you how it was applied and why it can't be applied. You're not to apply that. And it's said this particular maxim can be very dangerous, and we'll show you some case law a little bit later to back up exactly what I'm saying. So subsection 1B2 additionally provides the material may be used to determine the meaning of the provision when it is ambiguous or obscure, or the ordinary meaning conveyed leads to a result that is manifestly absurd or unreasonable. So one needs to ask, is the theory found based on section 2B manifestly absurd or unreasonable? I say it is. What about you? It clearly is, but we'll continue. Now, subsection 3A of, what have we got there? Subsection 3A clearly asks if consideration should be given to the extrinsic material in accordance with subsection 1, which we just looked at, or the weight given to the material to allow people to rely on the ordinary meaning within the text and the purpose or object of the Act. So the purpose or the object of the Act is to interpret words. That's why it's called the Interpretation Act. Now, section 15B, which the definition mentions at the base of it, says that, or provides that when the definition of Australia references provides rules as to the application of the meaning to the coastal seas of not only Australia, which is allegedly Norfolk Island, but the coastal seas of the external territories. Now, specifically, the coastal seas of Australia are in effect to be included in the territory of Australia, which is allegedly Norfolk Island. So you can see it starts to fall apart when you apply this definition in regards to coastal seas. So the provision goes on to provide the coastal seas of a territory, let's use Norfolk Island's coastal seas as an example, provides that the coastal seas of Norfolk Island are the coastal seas of that territory. But wait, how can the coastal seas of Norfolk Island be Norfolk Island's coastal seas if Australia is Norfolk Island? I know it sounds a little bit confusing, but when you look at what they're saying in this particular provision and you apply the myth, it cannot be so. Hence debunking the myth. So let's look at some case law that backs this up. And what this is all based on is a particular definition. And I've actually put the definition a few pages forward. Let's look at the definition. So the maxim. The maxim is the expressio unius exclusio arterius maxim. That's Latin. I apologise, I know it's Sunday morning. So it's a Latin maxim meaning that the expression of one thing excludes the other. So that which is not included is excluded. And that's what the myth tells you, that because these territories are included in the definition, that Australia is excluded and therefore Norfolk Island is Australia. Yeah. Now, it is generally used as a canon of construction of statutes or other legal documents, indicating that the express inclusion of one or more things of a particular type necessarily implies an intention to exclude others of that type. So it includes things of a particular type, which are the territories it's talking about. Okay, so getting back to the exclusio doctrine. So things of a particular type, the territories. Now, those particular things are included, and other things of that particular type, they're the only things that can be excluded, okay? It's got nothing to do with Australia being a nation state. So the particular types of things are the territories, not nation states, and therefore Australia cannot be included, and therefore Norfolk Island is not Australia. So let's look at some case law that backs this up. So in R versus Purville of 1992, Chief Justice Maria stated the maxim expressio unius exclusio alterius is no more than an aid to construction and must be watched, since its application to two or more contrasting statutes here concerned may well lead to a misconception of the rule. The rule is, however, a valuable tool, but one must be watched. I may observe that the method of construction summarised in the maxim expressio unius exclusio alterius is one that certainly is to be watched. Perhaps few so-called rules of interpretation have been more frequently misapplied and stretched beyond their due limits. The failure to make the expressio complete very often arises from accidents. Very often from the act, it never struck the draftsman that the things supposed to be excluded needed specific mention of any kind, and that the application of this and every other technical rule of construction varies so much under differing circumstances and is open to so many qualifications and exceptions that is rarely that such rules help one to arrive at what is meant. Now, on appeal to the Court of Appeal of Lopez, the maxim, the exclusio maxim, has been pressed upon us. I agree with what is said in the court below by Justice Wills about the maxim. It is often a valuable servant, but a dangerous master to follow in the construction of statutes or documents. The exclusio is often the result of inadvertence or accident, and the maxim ought not to be applied. So there's these warnings from the judiciary even. You are to use it in only certain applications, and it can be misapplied if you just give it a general application. So the Australian High Court and the English House of Lords have both been very strong, made strong statements against interfering with the plain and ordinary meaning of statutory provision. That injunction is to be held paramount, even if a statutory provision is seen on close examination, and depending on viewpoint, to be inadequate or not totally comprehensive in some respect or another. Both courts have, however, left the door open to enable the judge to find solutions where totally irrational or anomalous results will defeat the statute and the perceived intention of Parliament. So you can clearly see the misuse of the maxim can basically render you with a misinterpretation of that statute. And the central theme of rules of interpretation of statutes remains that words be given their normal and ordinary sense, and that the meaning of statutes and their provisions are to be determined from the actual wording of the legislator. So you are to take the ordinary meaning of the words. You're not meant to apply different meanings. Now, if there is an alternate meaning in the Act will provide that alternate meaning in the interpretations or the dictionary within that specific statute. Some people would say that is legalese because it has a different meaning to the ordinary meaning. But this breaks the myth that when you read a statute, you are to apply the ordinary meaning of words unless the contrary intention applies, which is the dictionary or the interpretation section, where they will give you an alternate legal meaning for that particular word to apply to that particular act. And you'll even see in some acts that some words will be defined differently for different parts of the act. So it depends on the application of the word. But in the Acts Interpretation Act, we do not find that. We find a precise and accurate definition, and it includes particular types of things, territories, and no other territories are to be included, because it tells you at the end of the included territories that it does not include any other external territories. It's thorough in its message to you. So do not fall for this particular anomaly. Now, let's talk about democracy, because this is one thing that's lacking on Norfolk Island, and it's probably lacking in a lot of other places too. So what is democracy? It's basically government by the people. Now, Thomas Jefferson actually said this, and this is from the Declaration of Independence, and I think you will remember these words. These truths are self-evident. We hold the truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inherent and unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I'll read that again in case you're still asleep. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. You must consent, and you must hand over your power to be governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organising its powers in such form so as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I've got the Sunday morning blues. Now, you'll see that in the pursuit of love, life and happiness, you have the right to self-govern, because it is the power that organised men exercise from you. So it mentioned unalienable rights. So what exactly are unalienable rights? Unalienable rights are fundamentally your human rights. Now, inalienable rights cannot be traded, they cannot be given away, they cannot be taken away, and they cannot be denied. But you can find some denials in certain parts of the world, especially in Australia and overseas on Norfolk Island. And I say overseas on Norfolk Island because I don't believe that Norfolk Island is actually part of Australia. I've got a legal advice from Robert Garran from 1905 when Australia was trying to annex Norfolk Island. And Robert Garran gave a legal advice to the Prime Minister as he was one of the Attorney General officers of the Commonwealth's law officers, and he was providing an advice in regards to annexation. And he pointed out there were 3 provisions of the Constitution that allowed for annexation of Norfolk Island to Australia. And he said, but these 3 mechanisms that allow for this to happen only create Norfolk Island as a dependency and will never be part of Australia. And we have many, many, many documents from archives and from the British government and various conversations between Prime Ministers and ministers and ministers from New South Wales, because at one stage the Governor of New South Wales used to be the Governor of Norfolk Island, and then it was annexed to Van Diemen's Land. It became a penal colony, and then in 1897 it was made a distinct and independent settlement of the British government, or the British Crown, should I say. After that, it was actually, well, in 1856, it was actually granted to the Pitcairn people who travelled from Pitcairn Island and took possession of the island and were given their own seal from Queen Victoria. Now, the right to self-government. Every man and every body of men on earth possess the right to self-government. They receive it with their being from their hand of nature, from the hand of nature. Individuals exercise it by their single will, collections of men by that of their majority. For the law of the majority is the natural law of every society of men. You have the right to self-govern yourself or by groups of men or women that come together in agreement, and you give them your power to be governed. And that's what true democracy is. And this is something that is being denied across the sea in Norfolk Island. Now, sovereignty lies with the people. And this is actually a quote from Quick and Garran, the annotated constitution. And it says, for the truth is that the supreme, absolute and uncontrollable authority remains with the people. And that is consistent with what Thomas Jefferson tells us, that it is by the consent of the government. And this leads to popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the principle that the authority of a state and its government are created and sustained by the consent of its people, who are the source of all political power. You are the source of political power. It is not you who is to be dictated to, as we find ourselves happening at the moment, not only in Norfolk Island, but here in Australia and within each state. Because I think that you'd agree over the last 3 years, you've been dictated to and told what you have to do, for example, in regards to your own medical autonomy. So this popular sovereignty leads to the right of self-determination. Everybody has a right of self-determination, or every people have a right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination is contained in Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in Article 1 of the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So we're going to have a look at what those conventions say. So Article 1 of both conventions say the following: all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. As I mentioned earlier, the people on Norfolk Island have had their legislative assembly dissolved, and there's been a silent coup on Norfolk Island, and the Australian government have moved in and claimed that territory as Australia. Remember, I showed you the definition earlier. Early 2016, Norfolk Island was not part of Australia in a geographical sense. or in a political sense, because they were self-governing and they basically came to Australia to have their laws rubber stamped and for protection, for military protection. All peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of international economic cooperation based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law, and in no case may a people be deprived of its own means of sustenance. It's interesting because in 2016, Norfolk Island was a thriving community and they had their own GST, separate from the Australian GST system, and it was generating around about $6 to $8 million a year. Now, it's interesting because when the Australian government moved in 2016, they abolished the GST. That's very interesting, a government abolishing a tax. You don't hear of that often. And what they did was they imposed land rates as a tax. Now, prior to 2016, there had never been any land rates on Norfolk Island. But then, after 2016, the people now of the island found this particular tax imposed upon them, as well as other taxes like Australian income tax. So prior to 2016, there was no Australian income tax on the island. Norfolk Islanders only paid Australian income tax if they earned or derived an income from the Australian mainland, not their earnings on the island. But now this was being imposed on them, contrary to the Enabling Act, which said that Commonwealth law does not apply to Norfolk Island. So, the state parties to the present covenant, including those having responsibility for the administration of non-self-governing and trust territories, shall promote the realisation of the right of self-determination and shall respect that right in conformity with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. Let's look at what that says. Now, signatories to the actual covenant, they have to promote the realisation of the right of self-determination. So if you put your hand up, like Norfolk Island have put their hand up and said, I would like to be self-determined and independent, then other nations that are a signatory to this particular treaty have an obligation to assist them. It's called decolonisation. Because since 2016, Norfolk Island has been recolonised. So there's a declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. So it's basically a treaty of decolonisation, and it's been going since the 60s. Now, it's interesting because there's certain things that Australia is seeking in regards to decolonisation. Do you remember there was a referendum in 1999? And you, the people, were asked, would you like to replace the Queen in the sovereignty of the United Kingdom and the Governor-General with a president and become a republic? And the people said, no, we'd like to keep our sovereign Queen within the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. But this particular act was seeking decolonisation, but they were asking us, the people, because the government have no power to change the constitution. Because it is you, the voting group of people in this country, that are sovereign and have the power to change the constitution. And this is why the government is not sovereign, because at federation, parliamentary sovereignty was thrown overboard and sovereignty remains with the people. And the High Court have attested to this many times. So all people have an inalienable right to complete freedom, the exercise of their sovereignty, and the integrity of their national territory. Solemnly proclaims the necessity of bringing to a speedy and unconditional end colonialism in all its forms and manifestations. But the complete opposite of this is occurring on Norfolk Island. Now, Article 1 basically states the following: the subjugation of peoples to alien subjugation, domination and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights and is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations and is an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. Article 3 goes on to say inadequacy of political, economic, social or educational preparedness should never serve as a pretext for delaying independence. So, you are not to delay independence if you are a signatory to this charter or this agreement. And again, when we look to Norfolk Island, this is what we see since 2016. We see again many human rights breaches of the Australian government. And I find it very interesting, as I said, that which the Australian government seeks of the British Crown, independence, they deny to Norfolk Island. So what does the Human Rights Commission say on this matter? The system of government established under the Commonwealth Constitution involves the exercise of the right to self-determination by the whole of the Australian people, and this includes the continued existence and functions of the Australian states under the Constitution and provision for self-government of territories. If the Constitution provides for self-government of territories, which is the provision in the Constitution that links Norfolk Island to Australia, which says that Australia can write laws for the government of the territory. If you dissolve the government of that territory, then you can no longer fulfil that constitutional parameter. And that's the issue here. They're ignoring not only their treaty rights or obligations, they're ignoring the provisions of the Constitution. Provision for free and fair elections, something denied to Norfolk Island. The rule of law, something denied to Norfolk Island. And specific measures to protect human rights. Now, why do I say the rule of law is being denied? Because when you walk into the courts of Norfolk Island and you wish to do any paperwork or apply any rules within the court, you must look towards the court rules of the Australian Capital Territory. Sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? I live on Norfolk Island. There's a territory called the Australian Capital Territory, and those rules of that particular judiciary are being applied to the judiciary of Norfolk Island. Now, the right to self-determination, together with the rights recognised in Article 25 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, may also be seen as relevant to issues of open and accountable government and to ensuring consultation with and appropriate participation in decision-making for people affected by government decisions. People affected by government decisions. They must be able to participate in those decisions and that decision-making process. Once again, it's denied. In a public meeting on Norfolk Island last 2 Thursdays ago, a woman stood up and made a statement that she had contacted a minister in the ACT, Christy McBain, who was allegedly the Minister for Norfolk Island. Yes, the Minister for Norfolk Island is a Minister of the Australian Capital Territory. And she was told that the Minister could not assist her because the Minister cannot assist anyone outside of the Australian Capital Territory. So there's this projection that you have a minister and a voice, Yet when you try to access that minister and exercise your right to have your voice heard, you are denied. Two classes of citizens: the people in Norfolk Island who have no political voice, and you that has a political voice. So the local government as the Norfolk Island government, because in 2016 the Commonwealth, or it's Australia actually, installed a form of local government as the government of Norfolk Island. Now, you must ask yourself, how is this particular Norfolk Island local government imposed on the people? Well, it's imposed by the Local Government Act of 1993 of New South Wales. So judicial laws from the ACT, local government laws from New South Wales. It's getting crazier the further we go along. So who made the Act? Well, the New South Wales government made the Act, and I've gone and had a look to see if this Act has received any type of assent, royal assent, from the Commonwealth to apply it to Norfolk Island, and I can't find any assent. And you can't find any parliamentary debates on this. It's never been read in Parliament. So let's look and see whether this can be applied to Norfolk Island. Because if you go to Section 4 of the New South Wales Constitution Act, it provides for the application of the Act. Now, for the purposes of this Act, the boundaries of New South Wales shall comprise all the portions of Australia lying between the 129th and 154th degree of east longitude, reckoning on the meridian of Greenwich, and northward of the 40th degree of south latitude, including all the islands adjacent in the Pacific Ocean within the latitude aforesaid, and also including Lord Howe Island. But it does not reach as far as Norfolk Island. So there's parameters. It starts at the Western Australian border, and then it goes to just outside Lord Howe Island, but it doesn't extend to Norfolk Island. So the Constitution Act and any other acts written under it cannot be applied outside of those geographical parameters, yet here we have this particular Local Government Act of New South Wales being applied on Norfolk Island. Does this seem wacky to you, or is it just me? It's absolute madness. They've made it up. I agree with that. So, who's seeking self-determination? And as I've said earlier, that which the Australian government seek of the British, which is independence, or they seek of us, well, they're denying Norfolk Island. And there's various other territories that this is happening around the world as well. And it's interesting because Norfolk Island, just recently there was a court case on Norfolk Island because the Norfolk Islanders have began or created a new form of government. It's based on self-determination and it's based on democracy. And they've created a separate government to that which the Australian government has put in place, because it's the opinion of the Norfolk Islanders that they are being ruled from an overseas location, and the people that run that government are flying in and flying out, the administrators and the hierarchy. They're not from Norfolk Island and they do not speak for those particular islanders. And as we saw earlier, Thomas Jefferson has told us that any form of tyrannical government, well, you can actually dispose of that government and start a new government. And this is what the people of Norfolk Island have bravely chosen to do. It was interesting because about 3 weeks ago there was a court case on Norfolk Island. And in this court case, Well, it's interesting. Things will get wackier as I go along. The judge presiding over the court case came in on a Zoom from South Australia. ACT, New South Wales, now South Australia. Everyone's got their finger in the pie. Now, the newly appointed Attorney General of Norfolk Island for the new independent Norfolk Island government actually attended the courthouse in Adelaide, and he intervened in on the case. And at the same time, the newly appointed Chief Magistrate of the to-be independent Norfolk Island government challenged the judge that was beaming in from the South Australian Supreme Court. And that judge was told that this particular judicial system that was taking place on Norfolk Island was not recognised by the Norfolk Island government, and nor was it recognised by the Norfolk Island people, and the case was dismissed by the Chief Magistrate of Norfolk Island, and everybody walked out. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all this is because people need to show their support for everyone in Norfolk Island, because these people are very brave people, and all they're seeking is what you allegedly have, which is self-determination. Because as you know, any of you can go and run for government. They can't. They're told they're Australian citizens, but they don't have the same political rights as you do. They're living in a dictatorship. Now, guess what happened a month or so ago? The Norfolk Island, or the Australian government, the regional council, announced that they were going to create an advisory committee, and they were going to have a democratic election where 3 people from Norfolk Island could become part of that advisory committee. Sounds a bit like The Voice, an advisory committee. So you could give advice, but it doesn't need to be taken. But it was interesting, some of the parameters were you can actually become part of that advisory committee, and the only parameter is that you have resided on the island for at least 1 month. So we could look at history, and we can only speculate what that could mean, and how many people have been living there for just over a month that could be voted in. So it's interesting, this particular anomaly that is occurring. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about The Voice now, because this is very similar to the plight. And I want to show you a small video. And this video will set the foundation of what's really happening in Australia. And you will see it's not as it's being projected to you by your representatives. Okay, I'm going to continue with the presentation, and hopefully our audio guy will return and we'll be able to get some clarity. So, let's speak about The Voice. And what I specifically want to talk about is the indiscrepancies that the Australian government are trying to hide from you, because I'm sure you've heard a lot of talk in regards to The Voice and what it actually could mean and what it means. And there's various obligations that the Australian government has And these particular obligations are found in a little known treaty that they ratified into law back in 1975. So it's the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. And you can find it in the Racial Discrimination Act of the Commonwealth from 1975. And it's a very interesting treaty because it is in complete conflict with the very foundation of the voice. So let's have a look at this particular treaty and what it actually obliges the government to do. So it's to promote and encourage universal respect for an observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, without distinction of race. Now, considering that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set out therein, without distinction of any kind, in particular to race, colour, or national origin. You cannot do anything that is based on people's race, colour, or national origin. National origin, originals, race, colour. You know why? Because it's discrimination. And you're being told that to vote no in the voice referendum, that you are discriminating against the Aboriginals, where in fact the government have flipped it to appear like that. And it's actually the government that are being racist because they attempt to do this to create division in the community in this multicultural society that we live in. And they're basically saying everybody that has come to this country will have less rights than one particular race. And I'm not sure if you've actually heard, but that particular race, if you go out into the desert and you speak to the elders, has not been consulted. And most of the ministers that represent the Originals are actually against this particular voice and this referendum because they understand the division it will create in the community. People need to go and express this amongst their communities and let everybody know what this actually is, because it is not a way to give more rights to Aboriginals. What it's doing is it's ceding the Aboriginals' land sovereignty to the government. So they're saying to the Aboriginal, and they're writing through their Aboriginal Heritage Acts, you can go onto the land and you can now police your land. So in other words, they're turning the Aboriginals into land police. You can't dig that hole unless you give me $7,000. Someone wanted to put up a structure and they wanted to charge them $2.5 million, I heard last week, just to put the permission to put up the structure. Now, that might seem empowering, and you might say that certain people have to pay the rent, so to speak. But I say that the Australian people have been paying the rent, and there's particular Aboriginal boards that receive over $4 billion a year for the Aboriginals. So the rent is clearly being paid. Now, the division that this creates in the community is that, is there any Aboriginals in the room, or anyone that identifies as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Because there are many people that do. Now, you will become a second-class citizen. You will have less rights. Now, The reason being is because you'll be scrutinised on your own land. They're even talking about changing the Mabo decision, which is that all Aboriginal claims to land that have been given Crown grants are actually in Mabo were extinguished. So they cannot be given the land back because you have been given claim to that grant of land. But that's going to change apparently. There's cases in the courts at the moment that will probably change this. And the Aboriginal who becomes the police officer of the land, as I said, is doing nothing more than handing the sovereignty of the land to the government to write laws that they will enforce. Okay? And people are saying it's a great thing, they will get control of their land, but what's really behind it, as I said, is the ceding of the sovereign rights to that land. He who writes the laws holds the land. So, in effect, they're creating a treaty where they hand over their land rights. And this is going to rob Aboriginal people of their true rights. If you speak to Aboriginal people, you'll see that quite regularly they will say that they are the custodians of the land, because this concept of ownership of land never came to this land until the British landed. It's a white man's concept, ownership. Yet all of a sudden we hear particular actors in the mainstream media talking about the ownership of the land and having to pay the rent. And as I said, if you go and ask anyone in the Aboriginal community who actually have a bond with the land, they're not interested in that. They're interested in handing down the land in better shape than it was when they came, to hold the land and to pass it on to the next generation without any error. So let's continue. Reaffirming that discrimination between human beings on the grounds of race, colour or ethnic origin is an obstacle to friendly and peaceful relations among nations and is capable of disturbing peace and security among peoples and the harmony of persons living side by side even within one and the same state. Convinced that the existence of racial barriers is repugnant to the ideas of any human society. Alarmed by manifestations of racial discrimination still in evidence in some areas of the world and by governmental policies based on racial superiority and hatred, such as policies of apartheid, segregation or separation. This is a form of apartheid. There'll be no separation between colours, which is the fundamental meaning of apartheid, but the two-tier system where there are certain rights for certain races, which once again creates division amongst us all. Resolved to adopt all necessary measures for speedily eliminating racial discrimination in all its forms and manifestations, in all its forms, and to prevent and combat racist doctrines and practices in order to promote understanding between races and to build an international community free from all forms of racial segregation and racial discrimination. This is what is going to happen in Australia after the referendum if it is successful. They're ignoring these treaty obligations that they currently have, and they are creating an Australian apartheid. So let's have a look and see if we've got some audio.
I think we can try and run it now. We've got about 5 minutes left altogether.
The people who stand with me on this stage I regard as giants.
Thomas Mayo.
Thomas Mayo.
Written a handbook called the Voice to Parliament Handbook. All the detail you need.
Thomas Mayo is a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but was also entrusted with the physical document.
Mayo is part of the referendum working group. He
spent 18 months travelling around Australia to garner support for an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
And I tell you what, we are sick of governments not listening to our voice. We are going to use the rule book of the nation to force them.
There is nothing more powerful then building a First Nations voice, a black institution, a black political force to be reckoned with.
Keep going until we change the system, until we tear down the institutions that harm our people.
And also to pay respects to the elders of the Communist Party, who I think, without a doubt, have played a very important role in our activism.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
The power in the voice is that it creates the ability for First Nations to go forth with coherent positions on what legislation needs to be created, what legislation needs to be amended, and punish politicians that ignore our advice.
This is a modest request.
Authorised by Matthew Sheehan, Advance Australia, Canberra.
So, as you can see, there's something a little bit sinister behind the voice. And what it is it's been a plan since around about the 30s by militant communist groups to upheave constitutions by using Indigenous people as a minority to bring in land rights. I've got no issue with land rights, okay? But what this is creating, it's not creating just a mechanism to have a right to land, but what it's creating is a new part of the parliament. It's going to change the constitution forever. They want you to pay the rent. I'm not sure why they want you to pay the rent, because guess what? You didn't land here in 1788. You didn't create genocide on the Aboriginal people. It was the British, it was the Crown. And then, through last century, there were other atrocities that happened, such as the stolen generation. Yet, all of this has happened before most of you were alive, yet you're the one who is to pay. And what does that do? It lets the perpetrators off the hook. And what's it do? Well, it creates a thing called Stockholm Syndrome, where the Aboriginals go to their captors and sit in bed with them. So that's what's effectively happening. And it's interesting because, as you can see, one of the architects of the voice is a militant communist, and the whole group of people are actually Communist Party members, and they are here to destroy our constitution and our way of life. And if people do not stand up and vote no and write NO, or the letter N, because this is what the Referendum Machinery Act provides, it doesn't provide for ticks, crosses, don't believe that. And use a pen, exactly. Now, I'm being told the clock is ticking, and I'm happy to take any questions anyone has. Lady up the back there.
Speak up.
Just on the topic of discrimination, if the government claims that Norfolk Island is part of Australia and they've abolished GST, why are we still paying them?
That's a good question. The GST that was installed on Norfolk Island had nothing to do with Australia. It was a means of supporting the infrastructure and the requirements of the islands, should I say. It's interesting that, yes, one thing that is imposed on you is abolished in another location. And the GST, the Australian GST, is not applied on Norfolk Island either. So right there is a reason to go and see your local member and ask why you're being discriminated against. Lady here.
Yeah. Take the microphone for them, Darren.
As voters, we give up our power of attorney. So to vote no, would that really have any effect?
Will voting no have any effect? Sorry, I was.
Yeah, because as registered voters in this country,
Yes.
registered voters in this country, we essentially give up our power of attorney. So my concern is, will voting no have an effect?
Voting no will definitely have an effect. I know a lot of people are saying that they are going to withhold from voting. Don't feed the beast. If all the people who are awake and want to vote no don't vote no, you'll get a yes outcome.
Are people aware that there's going to be pre-polling for the voice referendum like there was in the last four selections, elections?
I can't speak for everybody, but I'm sure it is being advertised though. So I'm sure people will become aware of it. Lady up the back there, or here.
Hi, Darren. Myself and others in our study groups here in Adelaide, we've been considering the differentiation between human rights and natural rights. It's our understanding that human rights are a modern thing, whereas over millennia we've had natural rights, and that human rights are applied to the straw man, not to the flesh and blood living being. So we're very sceptical of these human rights charters.
If you go and have a look at the, well, I can speak of the Human Rights and Responsibilities Act of Victoria, and I believe in Queensland and the ACT. And it states that human beings have human rights, and that persons, or should I say corporations, do not have human rights. I agree with you in regards to natural rights, but you'll find that unless you're probably in the High Court, they won't be recognised, and only the ones within the statute will be. So to exercise those rights, you can hold these statutory entities to task with those particular rights that are within the statute. But I agree with you, you never lose your natural rights.
Back to Norfolk Island. 7 o'clock this morning, as you do, I'm part of the Commonwealth Earth Group, and I was reading the minutes from their last meeting, and apparently since 2016, you can't give birth on Norfolk Island, you've got to go to Australia.
Yeah, that's right.
Obviously,
100%. So since 2016, they took away the maternity ward on Norfolk Island. And now if you wish to give birth, you're a woman, a mother, you want to give birth, you have to call what's called a medivac, and you are flown to the mainland, and this robs the child and the parent of the right to be born on Norfolk Island, and you are now born as an Australian citizen. Now, I believe there's been 1 or 2 people that have been born there, okay, but fundamentally, everybody goes to Australia and they are robbed of their birthright. And the Norfolk Island government, the newly formed one, are going to change that, and they're going to bring in a maternity ward so that people can realise their natural right to be born on the land where they were conceived.
Just about voice. There's a video circulating with saying that Dr. William May has done something in court. Do you know anything about that, about getting this referendum cancelled?
I believe the writ that he filed in the High Court was rejected. I had some people contact me in regards to him contacting me for some reason, and he's most interested in the discrimination treaty that we just went over, because that is something that the High Court could act off in regards to their treaty power.
Darren, I can explain that to you.
Thank you, Len. Please, everybody, Senator Len Harris.
The process that was used by the High Court, what actually happened, it went to a single judge. The single judge ordered that the registrar not accept the application. There was no decision and no reasons for the decision. That process is used by the High Court itself to weed out about 80% of the actual applications. My reason for contacting you, it was I who made that request, was to get you to explain to the doctor exactly what you explained here today with that treaty that was accepted by Australia. Can I just speak on people who are thinking not to vote? And I'll just remind you that the referendum is decided on a majority of votes in a majority of states. What you do if you choose not to vote is you are making it easier for the yes vote, because every one of us who vote, they need another vote to balance that. And also, they need another vote actually to be a majority. So do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. If you don't vote, they don't have to find another vote to cancel out your vote. And then they still need an extra vote to be the majority. Thank you.
Thank you, Len.
Can I say also, it is imperative, as much as we support the Indigenous people, you have to vote no in the first question. Yes.
No, not yes. Okay, don't be confused about voting yes. You vote no. But I can't tell you how to vote, neither can Len. It's your own personal choice. If that man wants to vote yes, then that's what his right is to do in this democratic society that we live in.
Darren, I think we should wind up at this
Yes.
point and get Darren. So thank Darren very, very much for the presentation. There will be another